I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and I have been so looking forward to this conversation. It has been a minute since Ayana Mathis and I got to hang out and talk about books and writing and her fabulous characters. 12 Tribes of Hattie obviously was a huge sensation. It was not only a B&N Discover pick, it was also a little pick of this book club called Oprah 2.0. I think wasn't she calling it Oprah's Book Club 2.0 when you were chosen?
It was Oprah's Book Club 2.0 at that point. Yes,
okay, so we go from Cheryl Strayed to Ayana, and it was great. And it was an amazing moment because we had a lot of people who suddenly were saying, I want to be part of this world. I want to be with Hattie and her 11 children and her grandchildren. And I still think about this book with fondness, even though sometimes it was a little bit of a hard read. But it's 2023 and that was 2012.
I know.
Where have you been?
Who's in hiding? No, I have not been in hiding. This book just took a really, really long time. And fortunately, other things happened. Like I've been writing some nonfiction along the way and things like that. But this book was just vexing. And it just took an extraordinarily long time to sort of become anything. And then it kept changing what it wanted to be. And it was very defiant and recalcitrant. And we had a lot of fights and we were in a really antagonistic relationship. And we had to heal. I mean, it really was just like a whole journey with this book.
We're now in the 1980s. We're in Philadelphia and also a tiny town called Bonaparte, Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
And I love these characters. And I'm going to keep it kind of tight. You do have a wider cast, but I'm going to keep it to Ava and her son, Toussaint, and Toussaint's dad, Cass, and Ava's mom, Duchess. And there are lots of folks who come in and out of their lives, but they're sort of the core four. And we meet them when Ava and Toussaint are in crisis. Essentially, they're in a homeless shelter. They're being thrown out, and they're in a homeless shelter. And we're in Philadelphia in 86.
Yeah. Yes? It's 2 years. So first it's 85 and then it's 86.
How did we get here? Because there's a lot happening in these opening pages. And there's one thing that there is like a little introduction that we're going to let readers find. But I really love Ava and I really love Toussaint and I really love Duchess. And I'm just wondering how we got these folks.
Well, so I'll start with the easy one. The easy one is Duchess, who just kind of like appeared. I'm so resistant to writers using really mystical terms about their characters, they just kind of, but oddly, she just sort of did. She had this voice in this way, and it was kind of who she was. Even before I understood what her name was or what her role was, I knew that there was this kind of itinerant, former blues singer of middling success, which she sort of admits at a certain point, like, well, it wasn't that great, but she loved it. And she just sort of had that voice. And it was a puzzling, she was a gift, I think, from the writing universe, and before I even know what to do with her, like I didn't exactly know where she fit or what she was supposed to be, but there she was. So she was the easiest of them, I think. Ava was when you asked me earlier, like, where have you been for these last 11 years? It's Ava's fault. She was the holdup.
Okay.
Jokes aside, she just was a really difficult character, and she's not easy. And she's not easy in the way that Hattie wasn't easy, I think. So one of the things that wasn't a struggle with Hattie, but was with Ava, was that I judged her a lot. Like I judged her. I didn't like her. I was mad at her. And so I had to sort of have an attitude adjustment in order to be able to write her in a way that, yes, she's flawed. Yes, she's difficult, but she is still sort of fully human. And it took a long time to do that. And it took a long time to find a voice that I could inhabit that would sort of allow her to come across more fully on the page, because her voice was just squirrely. Sometimes I wonder if it still is, but it was really hard to get her.
I don't think it's squirrely now. There were moments with Ava where, yeah, absolutely, she reminded me of Hattie. I'm not gonna lie. She did remind me of Hattie. But at the same time, her love for her son is really clear. And that's the thing that keeps her grounded. Even when she's making bad decisions, she's doing the best she can with what she has because of her child.
Yeah.
And I do think, I'm sort of bracing myself for some of the reviews and some of the coverage where people are going to have feelings about Ava's capacity to be a mother, because we judge. And you saw this with Hattie. We all saw it with Hattie with some of the reviews. People are like, well, she's just a bad mother. And it's like, it's a little more complicated than that.
Totally.
And I needed the Unsettled. I needed this novel. I needed someone to take on the 80s. I feel like we're revisiting that moment. We're reliving so much of that right now. And I needed someone to sort of sit down with the art and the characters and the language and say, hey, wait a minute. Do you see what is happening here? We are just repeating ourselves. And there's a lot. There's a lot in the Unsettled.
Yeah. I think that's also why it took so long. Like,
right.
I never want to be the sort of writer who's kind of writing from the top down. For me, that doesn't work. Oh, I have a theme. It's the 80s, or it's racism, or it's socioeconomic despair, and then sort of trying to invent these characters that are sort of moving around in whatever situation. So there is a lot that's kind of large and beyond me, I think, in the book. And part of what took so long also was really figuring out how to locate that stuff inside of the characters, so that it was a book about people in situations, not a book about a situation in which there happened to be some people. And so that, I think, also took a really long time, because so many of these issues are so big and so many of them are so close to me. I grew up in the 80s, I had a kind of unstable childhood. So a lot of these things are really close and really meaningful and powerful to me personally. So there was also that task of finding enough distance to be able to make these people artful people who are believable, who can contain all of this stuff, but who are not kind of marionettes that I'm sort of moving around through history and through, in some ways, my own story. My own story is not that. But there are overlaps. And so it was really difficult to find distance.
And overlap is one thing. There are slight overlaps with your actual experience. But I just want to be clear that this is not autofiction.
It is not.
That this is an act of imagination, that this is a way of setting us as readers in a world that is really familiar. But honestly, when I do the math, I'm a little horrified to realize how long ago the 80s were. And it's like, we've come a full generation, and yet we're sitting in almost the exact same place we were. And I'm like, wait a minute, what happened to progress? What happened to change? And in some ways we have made some progress. We have been able to change in some ways, but it's really striking to me, as someone who was also an adolescent in the 80s, like a lot of that is still kind of in the air, and to see people not get it.
It's very interesting. We're all sort of obsessed with the former guy, as I like to call him. But honestly, those Reagan years put so much in motion, and so much of what is now is coming from that, or is mirroring that. And that, I think, is, and we sort of seem to skip over the 80s somehow, or we have these kind of weird narratives around the 80s that are just kind of like cocaine, disco, stock market, these kinds of things, which sure, there was that stuff, but there was also this kind of intense political and social stuff that was going on that is absolutely laid foundation and ground for where we are now. And in fact, and that's maybe even a misstatement, it kind of was that. Do you know what I mean? There's this, it's a mirror, actually.
It's entirely a mirror, because the other thing is too, Bonfire of the Vanities has not actually aged well. It is it reads almost like a satire,
the other day.
right?
I hadn't read it. I haven't reread it, but I watched the movie again, and I was just like, it did not. Nope, not at all. Not at all.
And even some of the devices in American Psycho obviously have become sort of larger, pervading pieces of the culture, and people use sort of ideas from that, like brand names and all that kind of thing. And again, wow, the 80s are, we laid the groundwork for privatization and closing state hospitals and all of these things where we pulled the rug out from ourselves.
Yeah.
Willingly.
We laid the groundwork for the opioid epidemic. We laid out the groundwork for how to respond to the opioid epidemic. You know, I mean, like crack, this sort of decimation of the, you know, I mean, all of these things. It was like, and we also laid a kind of weird psychic groundwork in which it became easier and easier to sort of say like, oh yes, all of these horrors are happening, but we'll just kind of look over here. And I think like and that's the thing that's existed in the United States for a long time. But in the kind of very modern context, we really laid a kind of groundwork for like how to handle this sort of decimation and catastrophic events on our fellow citizens, you know what I mean? And on our brethren, really, and our sistren, and how to just kind of manage to sort of look another way. And the other way we're looking is often around like we're looking for money, we're looking for a leg up, we're looking for all of these things. And in the 80s also, you know, speaking of Bonfire, the Vanities, etc., right? Like it was like that's, you know, wealth became a thing. Do you remember how like in the 60s and 70s, I wasn't born in the 60s, but I remember when I was a kid, like, so like in the late 70s, like early 80s, like extreme wealth was like a thing that weirdos had. Do you remember this?
Yes,
like
I do.
It wasn't like a general aspiration. And for much of like what I can remember, even watching older movies, like it was like, oh, there were these really rich people and they were also weird and eccentric, and regular people weren't like that. It's very interesting. Like even the way that we conceptualize like wealth and our relationship to it is totally different.
Exactly, because CEO pay changed with Jack Welch in the 80s and GE. And that's the moment. That is absolutely the tipping point where suddenly the inequality goes off the charts and we're becoming Argentina. You know, it's wild. It's absolutely wild. And we've been sort of moving along this path. And we also have, as a culture, this idea that somehow if you are not successful, it's because of a moral failing.
Yeah.
And one of the things I love about reading you, and because this is something, okay, pagan baby, totally raised as a pagan. You were raised as a Pentecostal. I was raised Unitarian. Like Unitarians, it's coffee and donuts in the woods, right? Like pagan baby. But you do wrestle with faith. You do wrestle with belief, right? And it is, I mean, church, but also systems of belief, right? Throughout the African American community. I mean, certainly Asian American communities, there's a huge now Christian piece of it in a sort of evangelical Christian kind of way that was not part of my story at all. Like I said, Unitarian, coffee and donuts in the woods. But you know, you do it in a really modern way. You studied with Marilynne Robinson at Iowa. And I mean, if I think of Gilead, really is housekeeping and Gilead are sort of the two big touchstones for me out of her work. But she does a similar thing where the faith is there. It's clear that she has a connection to whatever system you want to call it. But you wrestle with it. You wrestle with it the way Baldwin wrestled with it. You wrestle with it in a way where you're like, I know this is part of the world. Toussaint has this interaction with a local pastor, and Ava does not like that woman. Wow, does she not like that woman?
Really, and yet,
oh no, she doesn't. She wants no part of it. But she doesn't say to her kid, you can't do this. She doesn't. No. And in fact, there are some connecting points later. But, you know, for some people, faith is a really easy decision. It's not necessarily something that they have to question. It's something that they were raised with and they continue to do, and they raise their families this way. And if that's what you do, that's fine. But you wrestle. You wrestle with it in both books.
Yeah.
And I just, can we talk about that for a second? Because I'm not even sure where to begin.
I don't either.
With how you wrestle with it.
Neither am I in some ways. I mean, I think so. I was raised. I'll kind of go back to a little bit personal stuff. So I was raised Pentecostal, very religious family. My mother remains a very religious person. My grandparents were extraordinarily religious, etc. I left the church when I was like in my teens. And then I went through this period where I wanted to be like a sophisticated, you know, modern person who was just like, no, I don't believe in God. I'm totally an atheist. Like, I don't like any of these things. You're all sheep, you know, the whole thing, right? And it just didn't stick. I tried to make it stick, but didn't stick. So kind of going back to the book, I think that what has remained, you know, you mentioned James Baldwin, you know, one of the things that he talked about, you know, I mean, he was rail against the Christian church, like just, you know, and at the same time, he was very much marked by it. And he would talk about how he was very much marked by it. And he wrote about it in essays, etc. Not to mention like the prose itself is often like sermonic and soaring and the whole thing, right? So I think what I have found is that I believe in belief. And I think that my characters often believe in belief in what we don't know, right? Like I don't think that Ava thinks too much about God, but I do think that she thinks about things like a homeland, sacred, larger than life, godlike figures who in her estimation often happen to be men. I think that she thinks about those things a lot. And I think she believes in those things and she seeks those things. So I think of it as a kind of religious belief, sort of secularized. Whereas her son, Tucson, is very much attracted to like actual belief in God. And like what and I think it's almost as though his mother is an obstacle for him being able to believe in God in some way that he would want to. And then there's other character, she has an ex-husband, Ava, who, I don't know what. I don't know if I think he's a true believer or so much as a person who sort of uses God as a kind of weapon or as a kind of, as a kind of bludgeon or a sort of tool of manipulation. But in any case, I think belief that is either directly religious or quasi-religious in as much as it takes on the enormity of religious belief is a really big part of this book, and I think was a part of Hattie too.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, I think Ava's ex-husband, honestly, it's both. I think he does have a deep faith, at least my experience of the character. He has a deep faith, but also he is using it as a tool to maintain power in his world. I mean, dude's not a good guy. But, Duchess, Ava's mother, I mean, for her, faith is what she knows about the land that she's from. She's born and raised in Bonaparte. She came back after her sort of middling career on the road. But, she talks about having the deed to her land and protecting her land and not selling her land. And for her, that belief is the thing that keeps her going. It is. That even though Bonaparte is becoming much smaller because there's a town next door that's encroaching and basically taking all of the land. And of course, people have had to sell because they don't have resources. There's a moment where Duchess is talking about having paid the taxes on her store, which has been burned down by nefarious neighbors. And she's like, no, you can't take it from me. I am going to go. And she pulls together the money and she goes and she pays the tax bill because that's where her belief system keeps her. She's just like, you can't take this from me. And I get that I don't like the rules, but I am going to pay my tax bill. Yeah. And then you cannot do anything. And I love that about her, where she's just like, nope,
not going to do it.
There are other things about her that are complicated, but that one moment where
that one's clear, right? Yeah. It's really clear. I think Bonaparte, like with regard to thinking about a religion a little bit, like Bonaparte is both Christian and not. It's a little bit sort of like old ways of belief. Like it's a little bit pre-Christian in its belief system, which Ava does have a little bit of it. And so I think I think she doesn't think about God too much. But I think she also, if she were, she's real skeptical of Christianity as a system. Like she's not into that. And Duchess has this kind of syncretized belief system, which I think was what Bonaparte had. And then, of course, there's the directly Christian. I won't get into her role too much, but there's a pastor who helps the family a lot, which Pastor Phil, whom you already alluded to, and how Ava's really not having her. And that woman is a very Christian woman, I think, in the best sense of things. Yeah. Like I think she's a true believer in the best sense.
I also love the image of her just sitting on the steps with a sandwich, waving her sandwich at people when they're passing by.
She's eats sandwiches.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, but it's her community, and the way she experiences community. It's not formal. It's not I have a role, but it's just like I'm eating my sandwich. You're walking by. You're my neighbor. I am part of this place.
Yeah.
And Duchess is part of Bonaparte the way Ava has not yet found in Philadelphia, but is trying to find. I mean, she becomes part of this sort of household where, okay, let's call it communal living, but it's not, it's just communal living. And everyone's raising their kids and growing garden, but they've also got, a clinic for the community and they're just part of the world. But when I opened the book and I realized that we were sitting in Philadelphia in 86, 88, around there, 85, I couldn't help but think of the Move bombing, which happened in May of 85. And John Edgar Wideman, If you haven't read it, Philadelphia Fire is an
Sure,
amazing,
of course.
amazing
Yeah, it's
book.
really great.
I know you've read it, just in case for listeners who haven't. And there's a new edition with an introduction by Imani Perry that is spectacular.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. I have a very beat up old edition. I own 2 editions of this book because of that introduction. Philadelphia had a black mayor who said, "Go ahead to the police, drop this bomb." Literally, there is a firebombing in a major American city. Countless people die. Countless houses are burned to the ground. We find out, last year, the year before, that some of the bones of MOVE members were in the basement.
Children. Okay. To make it just a little bit more horrifying.
Right. In a basement, in a building at the University of Pennsylvania. I don't think, and especially too, the way that some of the community responds to Ava and Cass and their house and their household, this is in the air, right? This is, you are not in a place like Philadelphia where this giant tragedy has happened and not have it sort of in the back of your brain when you have new neighbors fixing up a house and living off the land, right? They're trying to live off the land and whatnot. Yeah. How much of that was sitting in the back of your brain while you were working on this book?
I mean, it definitely was, I was a kid when the bombing happened, and I remember it very well. I remember the footage on the news, and I remember the adults in my household who would have been my mother and my grandparents at that time. I remember understanding that they thought that this was very bad, just as I thought that it was very bad. But we didn't talk about it. I don't think we've ever talked about it, actually. So it was, that said to say, so it was very much in my mind. And it's important to say that it isn't that. MOVE is still an extant group. One of the people who was in the house that was bombed is still alive. She just got out of prison not very long ago in connection to her arrest at that time in the 80s. And it's a wound. I mean, MOVE is a real wound in Philadelphia, where I'm from, in case people don't know, I'm from Philadelphia. And so I didn't presume to tell that story, but I think what it has left in me are a lot of questions about sort of what happened there, why it happened. And I'm a writer, so therefore, my imagination decides that it kind of keeps turning it over and turning it over. And so what the book, I think ARC, which is a group that Ava and Toussaint become involved in, I think that group is like a way to ask a series of questions about what happens if a group of Black people try to create an autonomous group that is running on a very different economic basis, that is not, sort of participating in the usual kind of market economy, et cetera, who are trying to sort of have some kind of rules that are their own rules, who want to extend something to a larger community. What does that look like? And what are the challenges to a community like that? What are the internal challenges? Because not everybody's perfect, it's also inside, right? And also, what are the external challenges? Like, what are the racial pressures? What are the economic pressures? All of these kinds of things. Like, what could happen in a place like that? And then also, why so often, when a group of people try to create a community like that, why does it meet state violence? Like, why is that almost inevitably the place where you end up? And so there were a lot of questions, and I think, the other thing I think is that Bonaparte, which is the sort of other pole in the book, is another sort of attempt at a Black utopia, very different, with very different motives and motivations, a very different kind of leader and leadership. So it has a very different trajectory. Nonetheless, they're sort of mirror images in a way, like almost like the Philadelphia stuff is a dark mirror of the stuff that happens in Bonaparte. And I think too, going back to thinking about MOVE and what happened there, it's super complicated, because the other reality is that MOVE weren't great neighbors. It was hard to be their neighbor, Now, the means by which having difficult neighbors translates into murdering them and blowing up a city block, needless to say, right? Like, I say anything about that, but so I was also interested in like what happens in a community where you have this kind of fractious relationship between the people that live there and the people that come there. What does it mean for a Black community to kind of be like, well, hey, these neighbors really kind of suck, and they do this, that, and the other thing. And for there to be first no response, and then the response is an outsized violence that also victimizes them. Like, what is that, you know? Like where are your rights as sort of a citizen in a neighborhood? Like, so it's about what happens to the people in the house, but also what happens in the neighborhood. Like, what is this whole dynamic? It's really fraught. It's really complicated. What I hope is that I don't think there are many clear heroes in this book. You know, I think the leader of our cast is right about a lot of things, but he's also a real bastard, you know, so it's complicated, you know.
Very charismatic.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely has his moments, though, where patriarchy is his friend. He's got some very definite ideas about what women should be doing and where. Mm-hmm. And yet at the same time, the way he comes across, it's very easy to see mm-hmm. how people would follow him and believe in him and want. I mean, part of what gets me about both books, but especially in The Unsettled, is, you know, you've sort of moved from, well, let me start with you and I both grew up in the Northeast, right? And there's this idea that somehow there's more freedom in the North. There's less racism. There's less this, there's less that, right? That somehow we're doing it right compared to the South.
Right.
Right. And, you know, Hattie obviously centers around the Great Migration and how that informed people. And here we are in the 80s, and it's kind of like you've gone from this sort of hopeful moment in our world and our perception of the world, right? Where the idea is you could go to a better place to better take care of your family and yourself. And then the 80s just kind of wipes that out for everyone.
Yeah.
And so like we're sitting in these places, right? North, South, these polarities, North, mm-hmm. South, hopeful, super not hopeful. We really do tell ourselves stories, right? It's all a form of mythology. It's all, these are colliding beliefs. Mm-hmm. And it brings us back to you believe in belief. And mm-hmm. oh man, some of the choices the characters make, and they are their choices. They are absolutely their choices. And there's some stuff that also just purely from storytelling point. I mean, you and I were talking about it before we hit record, but there's some moments in this book too where you do stuff with story where I was like, yep, this is awesome. This is great. Because why should we lose the joy of story though? I mean, we have to record this stuff, right? Like we have to talk about it. We have to record it. Hattie didn't want to talk about anything. Duchess doesn't want to talk about anything except when she does. And it's that generational thing where you're like, hi, I would like the stories, please. I would like, we need to have this recorded. And even if maybe some of the details are hard, there is joy in holding on to the story.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's joy in places that are unexpected. You know, I mean, like we were talking a little bit about before we started, you know, it's folks make all kind of choices in this book.
They do.
I mean, kind of choices, some of which we could really, you know,
I might have a couple of times. I might have.
But it's interesting, you know, like I think like a character like Ava, for example, who gets involved in this group with this man who's a lot of things, charismatic, etc., also violent, also there's a lot of things. One of the things I was interested in is to think about what joy or a good life or a fulfillment looks like if it is outside of the ways in which we have kind of agreed that those things should look like. Like, this is what happiness looks like. This is what, you know, joy looks like. And, you know, we have a little bit of there's a little bit of a spectrum, mm-hmm. but essentially, you know, the parameters are fairly fiercely guarded, actually, and very well defined. And so, but these people, even though I think this is a hard book and I think people have a hard time in many ways, I think that there is also this sense of which people have absolute autonomy, absolute agency, and they make choices that make them feel good or feel like they're sort of a part of something or feel like they found what they were looking for. I mean, that's certainly the case with Ava when she kind of gets involved with ARC. Like she finds what she was looking for. She left her home, which was a certain kind of utopic sort of situation, a failing one, but in any case, led by these two enormously larger than life figures, you know, her stepfather and her mother. And then she kind of gets to the north and she wanders in the wilderness, you know, that's what she does. And she can't find anything to sort of grasp onto. She can't find anything that feels like home. She can't find anything that feels like it means something to her. And then she does. And we might say, well, that's a bad thing to have found. I don't know. I don't know. You know, it's not what I would have chosen. It might not be what you would have chosen. It may not be what a lot of people watching and listening would choose, but it is nonetheless something that is enormous and means something to her and lends meaning to her life. And so I guess one of the larger things that I think about a lot is the ways in which for poor people, for people of color, there is this sense in which there's some goal that you're supposed to have, right? Like you're supposed to, want to become this kind of bourgeois, whatever. And that would mean that you had turned your life around or become successful or climbed out of poverty or whatever, like all those terms, In reality, for many people, maybe it's not that at all. And I think, if we could just even expand just a little bit our sort of notion of what a fulfilled life might look like, and therefore what our expectations are of people who we have decided are not leading good lives or who are failing, I think that a lot would change. There's just more breadth is needed.
Mothers are also more frequently on the receiving end of that judgment than fathers, without a doubt. I mean, and yes, it is a primal relationship, but we have also created this mythology around motherhood and mothers. And, some folks shouldn't parent straight up, just shouldn't. And this idea that somehow you become a more fulfilled human being or a better human. This is my favorite part of the trope. You become a better person if you have children. Wow, that's okay. We actually have empirical evidence that in some cases that really super does not happen. But okay,
not the case. Yeah, totally,
let's work with that mythology, right? So all of these things we tell ourselves. The 80s, we were barbarians. I mean, we're still kind of barbarians, but it was really all of these moments where the men sort of behave in a certain way and they're just right. Their expectations are, and there's still some folks who would like it to continue that way. And it's well, actually, if we're going to evolve as a culture and a society and as a people, language evolves, roles evolve.
Yeah.
We don't have to keep doing the same thing simply because that's what we did before.
Yeah.
And that's the piece, this weaponized nostalgia.
We're not still saying thou, just right? A dumb example,
I grew up not that far from Plymouth Plantation, y'all. I mean, and did they cast me as Sarah Alden in the Pilgrim play in the 3rd grade? Oh, yes, they did. Yes, because I was the tallest kid in my class. I'm good not doing a Pilgrim play ever again, but we're in no danger of that happening. But at the same time, I still laugh.
I was going to say, I'm have you been getting invitations or
no? Strangely enough, I think I'll stick with the book thing. But again, all of these pieces that we're talking about, right? Who gets to make decisions about their own lives? Who gets to make decisions about their children's lives? Who gets to make decisions about where they live and how they live? And yes, please don't be bad neighbors. No one's advocating for being bad neighbors, especially when you live in a very tight space and you really have to learn how to literally be a good neighbor. But the emotional payoff of The Unsettled. So the first time I've read it twice now, and the first time I read it in a single sitting because it had been too long and Hattie's great, but I needed something new. I didn't want to put it down because I needed to know what was happening to Ava and Duchess the most, honestly, because I was curious to see where that was going to go. And then the second time I read it, and I let myself sit with the discomfort because I felt really bad for Ava more often than not. And I felt really bad for her kid because he's trying to puzzle out what's going on with his mom, and he's 11. And 11-year-olds really, they don't know. They're very great, but they don't know a lot. And here's this kid trying to, again, what does home mean? What does family mean? What does community? And so I had 2 very different reading experiences with the same story.
Oh, that's really interesting.
And it's great. I listen, if you have time to read it twice, highly recommend doing it. But really, I was so curious to know sort of where you'd been. And you've just done this big piece for the New York Times book section on faith and how slave narratives are a form of prophetic writing, which if you haven't read it, go back, read it. It's online. But I see a lot of your nonfiction work popping in this book. And it's partially because you've been writing more essays sort of and putting them out into the world and whatnot. But there's some stuff that's burbling. I mean, you've been writing about class all along. You know, you've been writing about voice in lots of different ways all along, and also ambition.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. So Cass has an ambition that people might recognize, you know, property, community. Ava's ambitions are different, and I think she's going to be judged a little more harshly for it. And ambition, women and ambition, right? Like it's still a sore point for some folks.
And I think, and it's interesting. I mean, her ambitions are quite different. I don't think that she has so much a will to power as she has a will to be near power and to keep power moving.
Right.
You know?
Right.
She's very interested in that. And that's a hard thing to say, right? Because it's a hard thing because, you know, people could say like, well, why doesn't she want her own power? But that is her own power. You know, like that is her own power, which she wants enormously. And I think that she's also, in a way that she perhaps wouldn't say, I think it's just ingrained in her. I think that she also is interested in legacy, you know, and she doesn't, as her mother, Duchess is interested in legacy. And the legacy is about material things, sure, like actual land, you know, that you would pass on to someone. But I think the legacy is also something, is also kind of psychic and spiritual. It's about safety. It's about autonomy. It's about passing on to people some way in which they might become self-realized or self-actualized, or at base, not afraid, for their own sort of physical safety and also for their kind of intellectual and spiritual safety. And both of these women, the sort of, you know, the main female characters of the book, well, really the main characters of the book, they're both really interested in notions of legacy. And I think that that's also something that we don't think about as much, or rather, I guess another way to say that is like, that's something that we sort of often attribute or we say, oh, those considerations are sort of to like rich white people who have a lot of land to give, you know what I mean? Or want to go to Harvard, you know, whatever, like these kind, you know, but that legacy is only this sort of very, I don't know, lofty, like an estate or something like that, right? And we don't grant the idea that all kinds of people want to pass something to their children and will work very hard and do nearly anything to be able to do that.
Or that legacy only belongs to a certain strata. That legacy doesn't even exist.
Exactly.
If you're not part of a certain class.
Yeah.
And I find that extraordinary. I mean, you meet people who maybe have one photograph. And I say this as someone who was like frighteningly documented as a child, because apparently that's what my parents did. Less so for my brother, who's a little younger, but like we were those children. There are photo albums where you're like, okay, that's not that interesting.
Right.
But when you meet people though, who like have two photographs or one sort of real focused memory or experience or something, like it's a very different experience, but it is no less legitimate simply because there's a little less documentation. And that's the thing. It's like almost, you know, do you have your paperwork?
Yeah.
Can you prove?
Yeah.
Well, I'm sitting
whatever
in front
it
of,
is,
I'm sitting in front of you.
that your family is like a legitimate and valid family.
Right.
Like, are you, you know, and I think, you know, there's always also this interesting thing about there being some sort of a record. It's impossible for there to be a record of any family, right? Like every member of that family on any given day will have a different version of every event, right? But in this family, like these people in this book, there's a, you know, all the narrators are unreliable. So it's like what is the actual story? And there's something about, you know, we would keep kind of going back to this thing about belief in the series that I'm writing for the Times, and you know, the kind of, and having grown up in this very religious environment in which the Bible was like very, very sort of central to everything about my upbringing. And And so, rejected it, et cetera, but then kind of came back, not as a sort of literal document that's supposed to tell me what to do,
right.
but as a kind of repository of wisdom, but that gets to wisdom through these sort of like odd, sometimes paradoxical, just juxtaposing narratives. Like there's an accumulation of things that almost seem to contradict each other, that don't, and that sort of, that accumulation is the way that we sort of arrive at meaning. If I were to say that there is meaning in biblical literature, I think that's what its meaning is.
Right.
That's what constitutes its meaning. And so in many ways, I think Hattie was like that, all of these different stories about this woman who can only partially be glimpsed and cannot ever be fully understood. And she's not going to tell you anything.
Right.
So that, you know what I mean? So there's all these narratives that sort of add up to some idea of what she might be or who she might be. And I think the same thing, though, of course, structurally, it's very different and there aren't as many voices. I think that there's a similar action kind of happening in this book where there is no definitive record. All the narrators are unreliable. And so there is perhaps an accumulation of these people's experiences and voices that leads us to something that feels like it might be a truth or a thing that is real.
Which is why we need to capture the plurality of voices. Right? Like that's what our art should be doing.
Yeah.
Our art should be saying to us, hey, we all have a place. And yeah, you may remember something differently. It doesn't mean one negates the other.
Right.
Right? Like, I mean, there's a moment too in Ava's history with her dad, and when that happens, and I'm being absolutely vague on purpose, but when it happens, suddenly a lot of Ava made a lot of sense to me. When you realize, and I know you know what I'm talking about, but it is that moment where you're like, oh, okay, there are like, Ava may not want to give up her story all the way, but she's going to. And same thing, like Duchess doesn't really want to give up all of her story, but she's going to. I mean, there are people who try to control their own stories, right? Yeah. But ultimately, the only thing you can do is be a person in the world. Like, I mean, that's all you can do. That's it. Is be a person in the world, and hopefully you have a better go of it than not. But you can't live a life where you don't have the good and the bad. Like you need the two to exist.
You do, and I don't think you don't. I think surviving the world is a lot harder without a sense of that kind of multiplicity and without a sense of like that paradox and contradiction. Like if you spend a life trying to find the ways in which it's all going to make sense, you're just banging your head against a wall. It just seems like a great big recipe for enormous amounts of frustration. I was even thinking about land as we've talked about, like land is a really big thing in this book. And the land that is Bonaparte, is, I was also really, there are all these kind of Black settlements or Black utopic attempts or all Black towns or et cetera, that cropped up all through the Reconstruction, et cetera, some of which lasted, some of which didn't. So there's a long kind of historical precedent of all of that sort of stuff. And it, of course, like crops up in books too, like, Eatonville in Their Eyes Are Watching God or something like that. But in any case, one of the complications even of that, of a Black homeland in America is that it's not our own land either, right? It's there were some indigenous people that were living there, so
right.
So there's just sort of endless complications around like home and like home that is improvised and what has been lost or sacrificed in order for someone else to make home. It's very, there's a place in and actually existed, and it's called the Kingdom of the Happy Land. And the Kingdom of the Happy Land, I know, right? Say what now?
Yeah, I'm just having a moment with the place name, but okay.
Exactly, the Kingdom of the Happy Land, and the Kingdom of the Happy Land existed from roughly like 1870-ish to by the turn of the 20th century, it was gone. And it was sort of at the very sort of the tail end of this, basically the end of the Civil War. There were a group of emancipated enslaved people who kind of left Mississippi and they had this kind of leader guy, brothers. They wanted to find a place where they could be. And so they sort of wander around, and they wander through Alabama and up through Georgia and all these places. And they end up, it's a long story, but I'll make it short. They end up basically in Appalachia, sort of on the North Carolina, South Carolina border. And they end up like getting some land from first. There's a white woman there who owned many, many, many acres, but like it's the end of the Civil War, so all the people that she had enslaved that were working the land, they're all gone. So it's just her and like her son or something like this. So everything's falling apart, etc. So first, these folks agree to like work the land and like in exchange for food and etc. But they become more and more invaluable in this situation. They have a plan, and so eventually they enter into an agreement with this white woman by which they buy 180 acres of land from her for $1 an acre. And they essentially like form a settlement. And it exists for many, many years. It's utopic in its kind of ideas. Except for sort of, because there's also literally a king and a queen in
How many people were living in the community?
It's so much of the records of it and have been lost.
Oh, okay.
So the estimations that I've read go anywhere from 200 to 400.
That's not nothing. I mean, that's
not nothing,
actually
right?
like a town. If you think about the history of America, right, and these small settlements and everything, 400 people in 18 whatever. That's even 200. Like, no, it's not nothing, because it's not like you're walking down to Home Depot and buying the supplies to build a house, and then you don't go to the A&P to pick up dinner. Like, it's a very conscious thing you have to do. Plus, you're also trying to not get murdered. And they own the land
in common.
Right.
So people would build cabins and things on it, but the land was in common. Like resources were being shared. They did subsistence farming, but they also sold things. Those were being shared. They were teamsters, which then was like a term really like driving a team of like a horse and buggy team of horses to do delivery. So they were kind of like, they were sort of like 19th century truck drivers, so they make all this money, not a lot of money, but they make money. There's a long history, but then, and that's a very beautiful experience. It fell apart for various reasons because of reconstruction, like everything did in the South by that turn of the century is all the, and also a railroad comes, all kinds of things happen.
Right.
Also their own naivete and things that are happening inside the group. Point being, I guess 2 points. One is that there is even that land, it was Cherokee land, and so there are some Cherokees still like up in the foothills a little further who, and it was Cherokee land, and they were all removed in the Indian Removal Act in 1830, and they all walk the Trail of Tears, and then it becomes this white woman's land, and then so it's like, there is no, I don't sort of have an answer to any of that, but just to say that this sort of like endless complications of being and of legacy and of place. One of the things that I hope that the book does is sort of like just ask some questions about it, because I don't know what that is, and I don't know what to do with it, and I don't know even how to think about it, except to sort of wonder about it and ask questions about it.
I liked the questions you were asking, even when they made me uncomfortable. So yes, you did all the things you set out to do. I'm wondering though, do we think Toussaint is okay? Like, do we think he grew up to find his place in the world, or do you think he had a rougher go of it than some?
I think he probably had a rougher go, but I think he's okay.
Yeah.
That's sort of what I think. Like, I don't think it was easy. He doesn't seem to me to be a lost soul.
I didn't think so. I just thought he was going to have a rougher go of it than some, but ultimately the book ends on a hopeful note, I think.
I'm glad you think that. Sometimes I'm just like, what is what I think a hopeful note, not what other people will think is a hopeful note.
Okay, okay. I'm sorry. If there are people who think this book does not end on a hopeful note, that's weird. I'm sorry. That's just weird. The arc is also so very compressed. I mean, you covered 55 years in 12 Tribes with Hattie? Yeah. Like almost 60 years. And here we are sort of in this very, for you, compressed time frame.
I mean, all of it, back to your original, like the difficulty of, I was like, I don't know how to, how do I write inside of these, like what seemed to me to be, yes, very compressed confines in terms of time. And, for people who are watching or listening, who might be right. One of the other things I think that was a real struggle for me is kind of managing the time. Like I'm really good when you can sort of leap. I'm like, don't really care what happened in 1937, so we'll just go from 1923 to 1948. Moving, that's my happy place,
Right.
But this book really has to account much more, almost certainly in the first half of the book, but both, I guess, but really in the first half of the book, almost a dailiness or at least a weekliness. And so that was also, I think, a big kind of struggle. It was a lot of relearning how to write anything, any sort of myths that people have about, hey, you write one book and then you figure it was like I had never done it was like I'd never done it before. It was like I had to relearn everything.
Which, hearing you say that is wild, because that's not how The Unsettled reads. That's just not how it reads at all. I mean, I'm listening to everything you've said about this being just a bear of a book, but for you, everything feels organic in this book. Even when folks did things where I was like, oh, no. I get very involved sometimes when I'm reading a book that's set up in a way that I just connect. I connect with the language. I connect with the characters. I connect with the set. It just, sometimes you get all of the things you want in a single book. Not always, but when you do.
Sometimes you do, right?
Oh, it's
the best.
It's glorious. Really, it's so
really
good.
Something. It's transcendent. It's amazing. Yeah. It's amazing. Yeah.
And I'm really hoping that when readers come to The Unsettled, it is in some ways a different reading experience from Hattie. But again, like, there are some things that you've sort of been scratching at across your work, not just in the fiction, but across your work. Anyone who's read your essays, anyone who's read some of the journalism you've done, it all sits on a continuum, right? That is you.
The same
in your work.
It's the same questions. I think it's always just the same questions. No. Like explored in some different way, or some shiny thing catches my eye, and I'm like, I can ask the question that way with these people, or I can ask the question that way. But it's always, it's always the same. It's always the same question. And I think I'm so grateful for the time. I mean, I in the middle of writing the book, it was taking so darn long. I was like, ugh. But like it needed the time that it took, because I think it just needed the time.
Do I dare ask if you've started thinking about the next thing? Am I jinxing it?
I may have. I'm not going to say anything about it.
No. That's.
But I may have. It's just like a fantasy, like something I think about in the shower sometimes. You know what I mean? Or like when I wake up, like there's nothing. I'm nowhere near any language to bring to bear on this thing, and I want which is always sort of a challenge, that like between, but you know what I mean? Because you have. I was at some talk and Jennifer Egan called it, this was a few years ago. Yeah. She called it a voice hangover, where it's just sort of like the voice from that book. You're somewhere else, you're with different folks, you need to, but it just, until you figure out either enough time has passed or you write your way in enough, there's this kind of hanging over, mouth puppet that you just kind of keep sounding the same as the last one until it doesn't. Yeah, no, you know what? I think writers in the UK have an easier time sometimes than writers in the US, audience-wise. Like, I'm just thinking of Hilary Mantel or Jim Crace. Yeah. Or, I mean, people are just like, I'm just going to do whatever. And the book comes out into the world. And, like, especially if I think of Hilary Mantel, right? Like, there are a lot of readers, obviously, who know her for the Wolfe Hall trilogy more than anything. But there's some early work. I happen to love Place of Greater Safety. Do you know her book Beyond Black? It's astounding. It's one of my favorite books. Book. Yeah. And it's so weird and it's so other.
Mm-hmm. No, and I mean, she made me care about the French Revolution, which that's not really my thing, but Place of Greater Safety is this epic, crazy novel about the French Revolution. And I could not, and it's like 700 pages. And it's like, yep, I'm here for every single page. Anyway, Ayana, thank you so much. This was so much fun, but we could probably keep going for like another hour, and I don't know.
Oh, thank you for having me. This has been amazing. It was such a great conversation. It felt like we could have just been having coffee and having a chat.
We can do that too.
Excellent.
Ayana Mathis, thank you so much. The Unsettled is out now. 12 Tribes of Hattie is in paperback. If you haven't read it, go pick it up. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.